You guys absolutely smashed the like button in the last video, so now you get a part 2. This time we'll explore what happened in Asia and find out how the Cold War would go down. On the Asian mainland, an unprecedented Sino-Eurasian alliance unfolds. Nationalist and communist Chinese armies, hardened by years of civil strife, unite under a single war effort and drive the Imperial Japanese forces relentlessly eastward. By mid-1946, every Japanese soldier has been expelled from China's borders, pushed through the wastelands of Manchuria and into Korea. Without the power of the atomic bomb, which the US wouldn't have had time to develop due to the confusion caused by the population swap, the Allies settle for an economic siege, as Japan is now being cut off from the rest of the world with the help of a third of the Eurasian Navy, which was stationed in New Los Angeles, former Vladivostok. As famine and factory blackouts spread, Tokyo's grip finally loosens. In late 1946, an exhausted cabinet pled for an armistice. In a final act of desperation, and to satisfy Allied demand for reform, Emperor Hirohito strips Hideki Tojo of power and installs the new, non-aligned government. Yet, despite the regime change, the Japanese leadership stubbornly refuses to acknowledge the atrocities committed during the war. The conflict simmers down into an uneasy peace. After World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's Comintern government faced crippling economic and political crises that mirrored the real-world struggles. Corruption at every level of government further alienated peasants and intellectuals alike. In contrast, Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, cultivated deep peasant support through land reform promises and disciplined guerrilla attacks. So, the communists were basically on the road to win against the nationalists. Thus, alerted to the danger of a communist victory and keen to maintain a friendly regime in China, the government of the USSR dispatched advisors, equipment, and volunteers to help the nationalist cause. Meanwhile, the Soviets observed the Chinese Civil War as a way for the Soviets to once again spread their influence in the old world. So, they would try to ship arms and equipment over the sea to the communist Chinese. However, the British Royal Navy and parts of the USSR would enforce a tight blockade of Chinese communist ports. Even though this arms transport would turn into a failure for the Soviets, this would be a wake-up call for the Soviet states to begin expanding their navy and maritime capabilities. With Eurasian-backed Chinese forces, the nationalists managed to launch coordinated offensives during the summer of 1947. Armed with the newest Eurasian Sherman tanks and supported by US airstrikes, Chiang Kai-shek's forces gained advantage in the war. The war still drew on to a halt as various communist forces fought with guerrilla-style tactics that hindered the advancement of the nationalists. The casualties were in the millions, and to finally stop such a war, there were drastic measures that had to be taken. On March 15, 1948, a specially modified bomber carried the 15-kiloton device over Yan'an. What a beautiful day today. And the sun is already out. Wait, why is it getting bigger? The bomb detonated in a blinding flash that vaporized the entire city, which housed the headquarters of the Communist Chinese. This would lead to a swift capitulation of the CCP forces. Yay? You see, it would only be a short-term victory for the nationalists, as this nuclear strike would undoubtedly lead to a huge controversy, because, you know, they just wiped an entire city off the map. Okay, let me word it a little bit better. The nationalists wiped a city of their own nationality off the map. So, even though the nationalists have won, they would now have to deal with partisans all over China, which would prompt Chiang Kai-shek to instate a dictatorship and declare martial law, turning the fragile Chinese democracy into an authoritarian regime. Korea, at the same time, would be of little interest to both the Eurasians and the Chinese, since both would have internal affairs more important to deal with, such as the Eurasian devastation from the Second World War and the Chinese uprisings. So no American investment into Korea that turns it into one of the richest nations on earth. Instead, Korea will remain a country ravaged by the Second World War with little to show for it. On the plus side, I guess they are united now. Japan, during all of this, would be completely traumatized. My guess is that they would slowly distance themselves from the world. Trade embargoes, mistrust of foreign powers, and a political vow to never again be humiliated, throw Japan into a modern sakoku. Radio broadcasts and newspapers now carried draconian censorship, spouting a narrative of pure Japan, untouched by outside decadence. But behind the official broadcast of unity and strength, the streets of Osaka and Tokyo were full of unrest. Factory workers, veterans, and students, crushed by famine and widespread unemployment, took to the streets in massive protests. We will return to this at a later date, but don't forget, Japan at this moment is a crackhead. He can and will do anything. In the SSA, on the other hand, Stalin had enacted a second 5-year plan for modernizing not only the SSA, but also the South American allies. Stalin would create an organization called Comecon, which would help the South American regimes not only economically, but as well as militarily, since, as you know, collectivization never came without some cracked eggs. Even though the Soviets managed to spread the influence over most of South America, Brazil and Argentina entrenched themselves and resisted the communist influences, drawing ever closer to the Western powers. On internal matters, on the other hand, Stalin faced a new threat. The Canadian population was now subjugated by a foreign power which shared almost nothing with their new occupants. Canadians would of course form resistance movements across the SSA and band together to regain their independence. Stalin quickly found a solution for these new troublemakers.
Comrade Stalin, what should we do with the Canadian resistance?
But on the other hand, the SSA now had a huge advantage. Millions of Canadians that now could be trained into secret agents and effortlessly infiltrate into Britain or Eurasia. Overall, the SSA would focus most of its efforts on gaining naval dominance to challenge the old world powers and slowly spread its influence in the old world. I'm going to hold your hand when I say this, but Europe would suck in this timeline. The imperial powers such as France and Britain would do their most to try to keep a hold of their colonies. As you know, the Soviets would practically have direct influence over all of Africa if they would retreat. So, they are now between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, having to manage their war-ravaged countries, and on the other, having to keep together their colonial empire. The Eurasians would support keeping the empires intact, since this would hinder the communist influence in Africa. Also, since the Marshall Plan,
which was a post-World War II US initiative providing over 12 billion in massive economic aid to rapidly rebuild Western European economies,
mostly helped Eastern Europe in this timeline, people in the west of Europe wouldn't be living the best of their lives. Germany, while humiliated, would ironically be doing better since the Marshall Plan would probably extend to them as well due to their proximity to Eastern Europe. Now, just because Eastern Europe was financially subsidized by the Eurasians doesn't mean that they would be rich. You have to remember, the Eurasians were also devastated by the war, so that means that the Marshall Plan would be a lot weaker than it was in our own timeline. All these economic fluctuations would probably change a lot of things. We could see trade routes in the Baltic and Black Sea becoming vital for the European economy, as American goods would mostly have to come through this channel. This would lead to economic booms to countries that would have ports and cities in those regions. So countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece in the Black Sea, or the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, Sweden and Denmark in the Baltic Sea would go. This would of course eventually trickle down to Britain and France, and undoubtedly the Eurasians would eventually decide to help them economically as well. But it would be too little, too late, as by this point we would have By early 1954, a wave of coordinated insurgencies rippled through Central and Southern Africa. In the former Belgian Congo, rebel group detachments waged hit-and-run ambushes on colonial outposts. To the southwest, MPLA guerrillas crossed the Angolan highlands, armed and advised by KGB teams. The British and French colonial domains would also be under threat, with their forces being spread thin. Nigeria and much of the French West Africa would gain independence. Of course, the Soviets would have a big part to play in all of these events. They would be the ones directly or indirectly supporting the African insurgencies. The French would manage to keep a strong grip on Northern Africa, but considering sooner or later they too would gain independence, the French would have two choices. Either one, let them revolt themselves and become a communist country, or two, help them establish a republic and create an alliance between the two nations. I could tell you which one I would pick. Italy, having retained its colonies in World War II by signing a secret armistice with the Allies, would be reluctant to give away their colony. At the same time, pressure from the Allied powers would push Italy to decide between doing what France did and liberate Libya, or continue to hold their colony and face a war. And Italy chose civil war. You see, Italy would be confident in its military and the fact that they managed to go through World War II without their country facing much destruction. So much so that they would try to hold on to this piece of desert through force. Even though the rebels would have had initial successes, the British, who still owned Egypt and the Suez Canal, didn't want what happened to Algeria to spread to Egypt as well. So they would fund the Italian forces with different weapons, vehicles and volunteers. The communist Libyan forces would also be funded through the Sahara by the Communist People's Republic of Central Africa, a state that was forged by the African revolutions. Another group would arise in this conflict, that being the Libyan Republican forces, which would be sponsored by the Algerians and French. Yes, this is a three-way civil war. Eventually, the Italians would have to cooperate with the Libyan Republican forces to kick out the communists. But in return, they would have to give the Libyans some concessions, such as local autonomy, representation in the Italian parliament, and decolonizing Libya, letting Libyans rule over themselves. This whole African ordeal was a massive win for the Soviets, with the European powers having lost a monumental amount of territories. This would prompt the Eurasians to create an alliance to counterbalance the increasing Soviet influence over the world. Given the proximity of the US to Europe, this alliance would be both a military and an economic alliance, something like a combination between NATO and the European Union. Thus, the Continental Alliance Treaty Organization, or KATO, was born. To prevent the Eurasians from controlling the organization, there would of course be countermeasures. For any major policy, be it military or economic, approval requires a majority of member states and the majority of the alliance's population. Also, the KATO Executive Council rotates among regional groupings: Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe every 6 months. Comrade Stalin! The filthy capitalists have made an alliance to fight against our great Soviet Empire. Stalin? Now that the great Stalin has died, the question would be, who would be his successor? There are two candidates for this position. First would be Nikita Khrushchev, who would want to liberalize the Soviet states and de-Stalinize them. Of course, Nikita would mostly attract Canadians who were oppressed by the Stalin regime, as well as younger party members and intellectuals. On the other hand, Gregory Malenkov, Stalin's successor, would continue his reign of terror, and since Stalin was looked upon more favorably by the communist elites, because he spread communism to an entire continent and more, Malenkov would be able to leverage some of Stalin's successes to give himself some legitimacy. Thus would begin a power struggle between the reformists, led by Nikita Khrushchev, and the Stalinists, led by Malenkov. Not only that, but Khrushchev promised investment in consumer industries, which Latin American allies would have favored, since collectivization was still undergoing in South America, and they would need food aid and consumer goods to fully collectivize while suffering minimal casualties. But eventually, Malenkov, with the military and political elites backing him, would be able to win the power struggle. Across the SSA, reformist newspapers were shut down and intellectuals were arrested en masse, while Nikita managed to flee to South America. The next morning, Malenkov addressed the nations on state radio. Comrades, the traitors who sought to undo our great Stalinist achievement. But in Latin America, Khrushchev's promise of food aid and consumer goods had one genuine support. Malenkov, on the other hand, would focus more on heavy industry and the expansion of the new Soviet fleet. This infuriated the South American nations, which depended on Soviet help to maintain their regimes, and now were suddenly left to fend for themselves. Venezuela, although a communist country, would do the unthinkable. They would reach out to KATO for imports of grain and other essentials. The European powers would surprisingly accept and send over shipments of grain to help. Upon hearing this, Malenkov got infuriated and decided to start a blockade on Venezuelan ports. Nobody knew this yet, but this would be the first step towards